Welcome to the School of Global Journalism and Communication, Baltimore Reporting Report, presenting the stories we tell, Baltimore Visionaries. I'm your host, Dr. Kaye Whitehead. I'm delighted today to speak with Wanda Draper. Wanda spent over 40 years in the media. She began her career with Hearst newspapers as a reporter for the Baltimore News-American. Wanda went on to work as a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, in which she was the first African-American woman to hold the position in 1973. She was one of the founders of the Association of Black Media Workers and the National Association of Black Journalists. She also worked at WJZ-TV and Maryland Public Television. She spent 5 years as Director of Community Affairs and Visitor Service at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. She served on the founding board of the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture from 1999 to 2008. She's an award-winning journalist. She's actually in the Hall of Fame honors in journalism, and she received an honorary doctorate degree from St. Mary's College of Maryland. Miss Wanda Draper, how are you?
I am excellent and so honored to be talking to you today.
I am just so delighted. Now, when you wanted to be a journalist, there were not many women or women of color in the field. Like, why did you decide that with your career, the goal was to break the glass ceiling?
Well, I really hadn't thought about the glass ceiling, but in high school, I took my first journalism class, and I was fascinated. You know, he said, the fourth estate. I've never heard of the fourth estate. I didn't know what the first, second, and third estate were either. So I was very excited. I fell in love. I found my place, you know. So once I started taking journalism classes in high school, I got on the high school newspaper. I was the first African-American editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. I was just there. And actually, you just saw very few women, and definitely very few women of color in the field. And there was kind of a joke in my family, and the joke was, my problem was my mother worked and I didn't have proper guidance, and that's why I didn't be a journalist. So that was kind of what was whispered throughout my family about my choice of career, because all of the women in my family were, you know, normal things, teachers. And so I also had to make a deal with my father. And the deal I made with my father was that he would allow me, since he was paying for this, he would allow me to major in journalism, but I had to minor in something, quote, where I was going to get a job. So right. Minor in linguistics with this, you know, I could always be a speech pathologist, which I had no interest or no intention to do. That was the way I got my degree, because he just, everybody kind of felt, now you got to remember, I went to college in 1969.
Wow. Okay.
And so there was the thought that I was going to end up on a park bench being a freelance writer, because nobody could envision me actually making a living as a journalist.
So who are some of the journalists when you were coming along that you looked up to? Like, who are the people you said, you know, I just want to be able to do that?
There were none. So I thought James Baldwin was cool. But there were no journalists for me to really look up to. I mean, you know, there were women at the Afro.
Right.
I really wanted to be in the mainstream media. And when I went to College Park, most people in the School of Journalism had the opportunity and were welcomed on the Diamondback, the school newspaper. They were welcomed on Maryland Magazine. I was not. So when I went to the Diamondback and said I wanted to write for the Diamondback, they offered me the opportunity to copy edit overnight. And I said, no, thank you, walked out. And but at the time, I was still writing for the Baltimore News-American. When I went to the Baltimore News-American, I was 15 years old.
Wow.
And they never bothered to check on that. You know, I was tall for my age. They never bothered to check on that. They just read my articles in my high school newspaper, asked me to write stories about, teens. They had a whole section called Teen World. And so I agreed to do that. And then all of a sudden one day they were like, how old are you? And I said, 15. And they said, do you have a work permit? Because work permits were required at that time. And I said, no. And they were like, oh my God, she's illegal. First of all, when I went there, I didn't know I was going to be paid,
Right.
I was writing articles, and then Friday came and I got a paycheck. I'm like, whoa, I really do like this. And so in the middle of the day, I had to call my father, and he took me to the state office building, and I got a work permit because I wasn't 16. And so I worked there through high school and when I went to college every summer, I came back and worked at the News American. And then they offered me a job when I graduated, but they waited till the last minute, and the Sun offered me a job in December, and I wasn't graduating until May. So I went to the Sun.
Oh, wow. Well, let me ask you this, because my dad has often told me as an educator that my problem is that everything I learn, I want to tell somebody, right? Which is, to me, indicative of a good educator. You learn it, you want to tell it. But when I think about journalists, is that your problem is that you have questions that must be asked so you can get answered. So what is the driving question that if somebody were to do a story about you, about Wanda Draper's career, what's the driving question that you think has been the one you've been trying to answer with your work?
I always just needed to know what was going on. I needed to know who, what, why, when, and how. I needed to find out, and I needed that about everything. And my mother says that the minute I started talking, I started asking questions. So she really wasn't surprised, because I was one of those kids that always, well, why and how. And so, for me, it was natural. I just want to know. I want to know. And the one thing I miss about not being a working journalist now is not knowing.
Well, now, let me ask you this, because when I think about your work and that the fact it was groundbreaking, you didn't have journalists to look up to. And so for young journalists, you are one of the people that they look up to. Why is it important for us as Baltimoreans first, and then as a Black community? Why is it important to have our people from Baltimore, people from the Black community writing our story?
It's so important because we know how to tell our story, and also our story is important to us. And here's a perfect example. When I was at the Sun, and I went when I was 21 years old, and I was the youngest reporter in the newsroom, and I was African American, all of those things. And so Dr. Levi Watkins invented the procedure to implant the defibrillator in heart patients.
Okay.
And at that time, it was a big deal. People were just having heart attacks and dropping dead. He figured out a way to keep them, to determine that they were having a heart attack, stop the heart attack, and keep them alive. This was a big deal internationally, and nobody did a story about it. So when I found out about it, I wanted to do a story. And I asked him, why hasn't this story been told? And he said, well, nobody really ever asked me about it. And so I went over to Hopkins and I did the story about it. But I also recognized that at the Sun, there was an unspoken policy that the only time African Americans got on the front page of the paper was as a mugshot. Right. And so I decided that this story belonged on the front page. It was an A1 story, and I knew that. So what I did when I came back, the photographer met me there. The photographer took pictures of Dr. Watkins at Hopkins. And also by the time Hopkins figured out I was there doing the story, I was almost done. And they kicked me out. That was okay, because I had my story and I had my pictures. And so when I came back, I asked the photographer not to send them to the copy desk, to send the pictures to me, which he did. So I held on to the pictures until deadline time, because if the copy desk saw the pictures, they wouldn't have put the story on the front page. They just read the story and put it on the front page. So then they were like, we don't have the pictures. And when I gave them the pictures, it was too late for them to reformat the front page. So my story got on the front page. However, it was 5 editions a day. By the time they got around to like the 3rd and the 4th editions, they put the story on the front page, but they moved the picture inside. So that's why it's so important for us to be there, and it's so important for us to tell our story. We know our story, we appreciate our story, we understand why it's important, we understand the putting it in the proper context, and often they don't. And so it's important for us to be there for that reason. It's also important for us to be there because we can do this, and for us to be able to be seen as competent, because our skills are not considered transferable. So if you are an educator, the only thing that you're expected to do is to do that. You're not expected to do anything in any other field or in any other discipline. And so it's kind of the complex I call not expected anywhere. We're just not expected. And so for me, it was important to be there and to be able to tell our story. And I did that. I was able to do that. And that was very important to me.
When you look back over your career, and this is a 2-part question. So you talked about the story that ended up on the front page. Other than that story, is there one story that you look and go, that one there, I poured everything I had into that one. That was the one. And then the second part of the question is, what's one story that you never told that you wish you would have?
Yeah. There are probably a lot of those. There were also stories that I tried to tell that I wasn't allowed to tell. And this is a funny one, but there was a body found at Cross Keys in the Cross Keys Hotel when it was brand new. Like Cross Keys was new, it was a big deal. 83 was new, Cross Keys was new, it was a big deal. And so I hop on over to Cross Keys and find out that the dead man is the person who was at the time president of the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company. Wow. And so this is a big story. And so I write the story, and we also find out that he was there with another woman who wasn't his wife.
Oh my.
And so I wrote the story. I wrote it all. And so when my story came out, it was an obituary that talked about how great he was. Never mentioned that he died in a hotel room with another woman.
Wow. So they reshaped your story.
Reshaped my story. So yeah, it happens,
So what's the one that you're most proud of? Like, what's the one?
I think, I am proud of just a positive stories that I was able to do, because when I entered the field, there were very few positive stories. Nobody came into our community or interviewed us. Nobody, our people did not have, and our organizations did not have PR people, which probably wouldn't have mattered. We still wouldn't have got in because they just did not cover us. Mm-hmm. So I was able to do one story I was able to do, and it was the first story about an African-American entity in the Sunday Sun magazine. Mm. And it was a story about the history of Sharon Baptist Church in West Baltimore, because all of the major industries in Baltimore started at Sharon Baptist Church. The Afro started there, the first African-American laundry started there, there was so much history about things that were active in the African-American community that started in the church, because that was the meeting place. That was the place where you could go and have these meetings and form all of these institutions. And so I did that story, and it was on the cover of the Sunday Sun magazine, which also there were no African Americans in any position on the Sunday Sun magazine. And so I went and pitched the story to them, and I wasn't even a writer for the Sunday Sun magazine. And they said, well, we're not going to pay you. And I didn't care about being paid. I wanted that story to be told, that we had all of this rich history in Baltimore, and we had all of these institutions that were vital to the African American community. And so to be able to tell those stories, the other story I told, and it was picked up by the APY and became a national story, and now churches all over the country are doing it. But I did the story about Saturday church school at New Shiloh and how Black churches were recognizing the importance of using Sunday school as a tool, a teaching tool for African American children. And so African American children were going to Saturday church school for 3 hours on Saturday.
Wow.
And while they had a Bible study class, they were also doing everything from English, physics, with certified teachers. And then churches across the country started doing that. Churches across the country were pouring in to Baltimore to go to New Shiloh and see what this Saturday church school model was all about. So I was very proud of that. And I was just proud I was able to tell the stories so that readers could see us as professionals and, interview people who were doing great and amazing things, whose stories would never have been told ordinarily.
Now, do you feel that with the long eye of history that you have, do you feel that we've come back to the point where the only stories being told about us are stories of Black death and Black trauma, that we can all say the names of Trayvon and we can all say the names of George Floyd, but we're not talking about the Black mathematicians or scientists. We're not talking about Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett and her groundbreaking work around the COVID-19 vaccine. But if I say hands up, everyone says don't shoot.
Right, exactly. And so when we were, it was Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud.
Yes.
And, it was Jesse Jackson's slogans. But one of the things that happened in the 70s that was groundbreaking is all of a sudden there was this surge in interest to hire African Americans. And so I had a friend that got hired by Time magazine. At the Sun, we kind of, between the Morning Sun and the Evening Sun, we went from like 1 to 2, to 7 or 8, and across the country, they started, African Americans started being hired in the National Association of Black Journalists, and everybody started coming to the conference, and everybody would hire 1 or 2, but we were there. And finally, Time magazine, we had a celebration because Time magazine nationally had 10 African American journalists.
Wow.
And then, we kind of went through that stage and it was great. We all got there. And then we kind of looked up and we were back to only 1 again. And so we've come full cycle now, and we're kind of back to that. And when I had the conversation with Dr. Corbett, I was like, how come we didn't know about you? Because the first thing I asked her was, so how do you become an infectious,
Right.
And she told me the story, which was very, very interesting, about how she wanted a summer job and she went and got a job at a department store. Her mother said, no, you're not working there. You need to work someplace where you can learn something. And then she got a job in a lab and got interested in infectious diseases. So COVID-19 hits, and the person who has the most experience, who has been dealing with COVID, not 19, but COVID for, 7, 8, 9 years, who did Ebola? She did. Who did the chicken flu? Who did S1N1? Who did all of those? She did. Nobody knew. Yeah. Nobody knew. How is that? How is that? Because because we're not telling our story. And it's interesting because as you look at the cycle, we all wanted to be, in these mainstream media. And I now look at Anyway, I can't remember his name now. That's what happens when you're 70. But but I look at a really good friend of mine who started out in a small TV station in the South and then worked his way up. And then he came to Baltimore to be news director at WBAL. And then he went to be vice president of news at CBS News. And he's moved around. And now he is CEO of the Black Information Network. Because he has come full cycle and now he wanted to tell our story. You know, and the reason that I went to the Lewis Museum when I should have been retired was because I wanted to tell our story. And it's so important. And when you see the look on kids' faces when they hear and see our story, you understand how important it is, because they're like, wow, I didn't know. You know, I watched the kids see a painting of Jesse Owens, and he was like, I like to run. So he could relate to Jesse Owens. When they, you know, Frederick Douglass said a long time ago, our kids can't be what they can't see.
Right.
So this is not a new concept.
Right.
We knew this then. So, you know, it's so important. And, you know, I said I wasn't going to do any work, and then PBS asked me to work on 2 documentaries, one on Frederick Douglass and one on Harriet Tubman. Why? Because all the books are written by other people other than us.
Right.
And so, you know, this is great, getting to tell this story and work on this project. We're a year behind because of the pandemic, but this is going to be the story of Frederick Douglass and the story of Harriet Tubman from us. Right.
Well, let me ask you this, because we have come through this pandemic. And one of the things that my son said, I mean, he's 18, he said, you know, what the pandemic revealed to him and all his 18-year-old wisdom is what he was passionate about. He said, when I had all the time in the world, the thing I did the most is what I realized I'm passionate about. And that was, for him, it was fencing. So for you, coming through this pandemic, what did you find out about yourself? What are you still passionate about, even as you're on the other side of this big career where you should be retired and you're not? What are you still very passionate about?
I'm still passionate about us not being expected anywhere. I'm still passionate about what we can do to continue. We have had some success and we have made some advances, but I just think there's so much more that can be done. And so I am still passionate about moving us forward.
Now, you are an example of a lifetime of work being poured. I mean, you're 15 years old. You were started on this journey, and you mentioned a little while ago that you're 70. So that's years on this journey. I have a couple of questions for Wanda Draper, not the journalist. Wanda Draper, not, heading up the Lewis Museum. Wanda Draper, not still doing projects for PBS so she can tell our story. But I want to ask you, what brings you joy?
Oh, so what brings me joy? Family, absolutely. Family. I got one of the things I got over the pandemic was a different perspective, because my granddaughter was a senior at New York University. And she called and said, we were talking, and she was really supposed for spring break, she was supposed to go to Miami with some friends. And I was a little nervous about that as the virus was coming. And we're saying, well, somebody should tell her not to go. I said, nope, I'm not going to tell her not to go. And I didn't. Mm-hmm. She called and she said, we've thought about it. We've talked to our friends down there and we're not going. And so I said, okay, you want to come here for a spring break? She says, well, she had moved into an apartment. She said, I'm going to hang out, and just relax. And I said, okay. And then 2 days later, she goes, it's getting really bad up here. I think I'm coming home. And she asked me, see, this is the difference between us and them. She asked me, could I send a driver to pick her up? What you need to do is get on a bus or a train and come home.
Get here.
Right. And so she called back and she says, I got a ticket. I'm on the Bolt bus, but I'm not coming downtown. It's going to White Marsh. and can you pick me up at White Marsh? So we picked up at White Marsh, and she had a little suitcase. And then she had on a mask. She had on gloves.
Wow.
And she says, it's bad in New York. And so she said, I got an email and school's going to stay closed another week. So do you mind if I stay another week? And I'm like, no. So 15 months later, but, you know, living in the house with a 21-year-old, but it was actually fun. We had a great time. She graduated from NYU. We sat on the sofa and we watched the graduation ceremony. We lived through her job search, and, you know, she had this goal for herself that she was going to apply for 200 jobs a week. In the middle of the pandemic, she found a job. And then 2 months later, she found that she got one of the other jobs she had applied for. So in April, she moved back to New York, and on Wednesday, she went in the office for the first time. So, you know, it was just a joy. We had never spent 15 months together, especially stuck in the house and, you know, getting used to ordering out and, you know, having food delivered. And, you know, she was just an ace at it. And she became our tech gizmo. She taught us how to do everything. So it was fun. But, you know, that's the thing that brings me joy is family. My husband's now retired. And this is the first time we've ever spent this much time together. And, you know, despite how long we've been married, he's not seeing patients and not getting calls in the middle of the night. We just have each other. And I love that. It's been tremendous. It's been a lot of fun. And the other thing that brings us joy is traveling. And so we did have like a year before the pandemic, and it was great. We went to the Caribbean. We went on a Soul Train cruise, which was a blast. We went to Dubai, and then my granddaughter called and said, and she was studying abroad in Paris, and she said, you know, I'm going to turn 21 and I'm here by myself. I was wondering if you'd come. So we went to Paris for 2 weeks. And we've been to Paris, but we haven't been to Paris with a Black person. So we didn't know that there was Little Africana in Paris. Did you know that?
Wow. Yes, I did.
Oh, okay. All right. So we got home.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I went to Paris with my mom, and I said, we're going to find Black people in Paris, Mom.
But so hanging out with a 21-year-old and their friends in Paris, we saw Paris different.
Oh, this is wonderful.
And then we came home from Paris, and we decided to go to the South Pacific for a month. And so we did that, and we were the last ship to get back into LA before the port was closed. And we were the last flight out of LA.
Wow. So you were meant to get back home and be here.
We had a wonderful year. We were gone 6 months out of the year, and we got home for the pandemic. And we also had a Last Supper because a friend of ours said, meet us for drinks at Ruth Chris. So we went to Ruth Chris and had dinner and hung out, and that was our last supper, last flight, last cruise. Well, then, you know what? Here's my last question for you. When you think about Baltimore and where Baltimore has come from and where we are now, what do you think we could do that could save Baltimore or transform Baltimore? What do you think we could do? Well, honestly, what I think, and I say this and I get criticized for it, but I think what we could do is come together and develop some strong leadership. We do not have that. We do not have strong leadership. We do not have a Howard P. Rawlings who could summon up the respect and the support. We do not have a George Russell who could raise $38 million and build an African-American museum, an 82,000 square foot brand new African-American museum. We we do not have the leaders that could that could get us to come together and decide who is going to be the best candidate, who can win, who can do what's better for the greater good. We're all just out there trying to do it all. We don't have that leader. We don't have that. And I think that's important, and I think that's what we need. And I just see such lapses in leadership on the state level, on the city level, in our communities. We just don't have that. So we don't have the integrity. We don't have the civility. We're looking at what everybody else is doing and thinking we can do that, and we cannot. And we cannot do it unless we come together. Individually, we can make individual accomplishments, but we can't move the whole forward individually. It's a collective effort.
Thank you so much. Wanda Draper spent over 40 years in the media. She began her career with Hearst newspapers as a reporter for the Baltimore News American. She's supposed to be retired. She is not. She's doing a major project on films about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman for PBS, told by us, about us, and for everyone to share in. I'm Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and this has been the School of Global Journalism and Communication, Baltimore Reporting Report, presenting the stories we tell, Baltimore Visionaries. Thank you so much, Wanda Draper.